Hello, students, and welcome back. I hope you all had a decent and somewhat restful spring break. I also hope you took some time to review the syllabus a little more um, deeply and also kind of familiarize yourself a little bit more with the Canvas page. If you still have questions moving forward, don't hesitate to reach out to me. But if it takes me a while to respond, there are user guides, and you can just like type your question in, and they usually have the answer with pictures attached. So that's a really great resource you can look into if you need help with that. And also, when you're using the library, you should always make sure that you're signed in. And sometimes you have to just keep trying. The site can be very, very tricky. Um, Other than that, I guess we should get started on your module lecture 4. And this is on the Bourbon reforms and autonomy movements in Latin America. So we're going to be talking about the Latin American revolutions within the context of the Age of Atlantic revolutions. We're going to talk about the Enlightenment philosophy that inspired independence leaders in Latin America. We're also going to talk about how these autonomy movements and these early independent movements began. So, before we talk about the Bourbon reforms, we have to talk about how Spanish America related to mainland Spain prior to the implementation of these Bourbon reforms. So the distance between Spanish America and the Iberian Peninsula kept the Americas pretty autonomous. The time to get communication back and forth was very long. It's an arduous journey. So you could pretty much just basically say you didn't get a letter from the king. And then within Spanish America itself, the distance between cities and all this wide open space in between really limited the royal authorities in the capitals of the viceroyalties. So, for instance, the viceroy of Peru had very little authority outside of Lima unless he wanted to assert it with military force of some kind. And in the early 1700s, the Bourbon Dynasty comes to power in Europe. They're out of France, and they come to replace the Habsburgs in France, but also in Spain and Portugal. And so these Bourbon monarchs begin to look at their territories in the New World more as colonies rather than kingdoms. And so what that means is that rather than seeing the Europeans of the Americas as their equals, they're seeing them as kind of colonial subjects. They only exist to serve Spain, right? So at this time, Europe is embroiled in a lot of wars with one another. England and France are going at each other. Spain and Portugal are at war. And the Bourbon monarchs are really looking to start raising revenues. So one of the first things they do is they increase taxes on all castes. So this is everything from indigenous tribute all the way up to the royal fifth for a silver mine owner. It restricted the manufacturing of finished goods in America. That was in the Americas, so that is to increase the amount of revenue Spain can earn for itself by exporting manufactured goods to the New World. It increased the preferential treatment for Peninsulares over Creoles, meaning that they just wanted more loyal people who were born in Spain or in Portugal in these royal posts. The Bourbons also attempt to assert more control over the Catholic Church. They tighten the monopoly of trade over Spanish America and Portugal over Brazil in order to make sure that they're getting as much revenue as they possibly can out of the Americas. And they're also going to attempt to modernize production. So this is when you have mercury amalgamation introduced in the silver mines. You have some infrastructure built to try to make the export economies of Spanish America and Brazil more efficient. And they're also trying to make the bureaucracy a more efficient tool for collecting government revenue. So this is the overall goal of the Bourbon reforms. Bourbon referring to the Spanish reforms and Pombaline referring to the Portuguese. So how do we get, in general, from the Bourbon reforms to the independence wars? So the Creoles, these native sons, get mad that they're having to pay more taxes. They are not able to make as much money as they were before, and they're not able to move up into these royal and ecclesiastical offices as high as they were before. And then in 1808, Napoleon, who's taken control of France in the midst of the French Revolution, invades the Iberian Peninsula. And he kicks the Spanish king and the Portuguese king out. And this is when the Creoles in Spanish America began to think about reasserting kind of their own independence within the Spanish and Portuguese empires. In 1812, Napoleon's kicked out and the Spanish and Portuguese kings come back. And we'll talk about Brazil. Brazil is a different case, but as the king starts to try to re-centralize power under himself, the Creoles of Spanish America begin to demand they break out into open rebellion and they begin demanding independence. So that's where we're headed today. Now, at this time, the Atlantic world is just rocked by a number of revolutions. And the first of these is the American Revolution. So it's kind of considered the starting point. And what we really need to know about the American Revolution is that these kind of wealthy elite men in the 13 colonies who decided that they wanted independence from Great Britain and wrote the Declaration of Independence and did all of these things, they galvanized a small strata of wealthy Creoles who wanted to do the same thing. And this is when you start having rebellions throughout the Western Hemisphere in French, Portuguese, British, and Spanish colonies. The next revolution is the French Revolution. It's very complex, but one of them is just how extravagant the royalty is, the royal court is, and how hungry the rest of France is. They've been, riddled by war for years. And so there's this huge rebellion. This is a storming of the Bastille. And in 1789, a new assembly promulgates the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which introduces ideas such as popular sovereignty, individual freedoms and rights, such as the right to practice your own religion, the right to free speech, and it destroyed the feudalistic order in France. So you don't have these large lords ruling over serfs on these feudal estates anymore. But I don't know how much you all know about the French Revolution. There are counter-revolutions. It's very hectic. And in 1799, Napoleon seizes power. In 1807 and 1808, he invades the Iberian Peninsula. In Spain, he installs a new king that is loyal to him, but Emperor Zhao of Portugal managed to escape, and he actually sets up his court in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And so that's what's going to make Brazil's path to independence from Portugal a little bit different from Spanish America's path to independence from the Kingdom of Spain. The first Latin American nation to gain independence is Haiti. And we're going to talk more about the Haitian Revolution when we get to abolition next lecture. But Haiti is going to become free as a result of a massive slave revolt. And it's going to be the only successful slave revolt in the world, the first independent nation in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the first independent Black nation in the world. Tales of how violent the Haitian Revolution was apparent. There, a bunch of wealthy French fled the colony and came to the United States, went to Brazil, went to Latin America, and we're talking about how violent the slaves were as they were overthrowing the French. And that made a lot of elites across the region very afraid of seeking independence and losing control of these large populations of Black, Indigenous, African, and mixed race peoples over whom they're ruling. But we'll talk more about that next week. So here's Emperor Zhao. Very interesting looking figure. I guess thick eyebrows were in style then as well. He ended the colonial trade monopoly for Brazil, which meant Brazil could trade with with the United States, with Great Britain. It was one of the ways that he kept some of the native Brazilians loyal to him. But he did favor Portuguese officials like the Bourbons on the Spanish throne. They began to cause tension with Brazilian elites when he restricts the slave trade. So he tries to outlaw the importation of slaves from Africa. And that causes a rebellion. So in 1816, he grants autonomy to Brazil by elevating Brazil to equal status within the Portuguese Empire, meaning that Brazil would have representation within the Portuguese government, kind of like North Carolina does within the United States government. But in 1821, he returned to Portugal. Now, I hope that you notice that this is far, far after Napoleon was kicked out of the Iberian Peninsula. Zhao actually really loved Rio and wanted to stay, and only went back because there was a rebellion in Portugal. But he leaves his son, Dom Pedro I, as regent, as ruler in Brazil. But ongoing Creole unrest against the Regency forced Pedro the first to declare independence for the Brazilian Empire in 1822. So he declares himself emperor of an independent Brazilian empire. In Spanish America, things are going to go very much differently. When Napoleon invades Spain, the Spanish court create their own, what's known as the Courts of Cadiz, these representative bodies to kind of take care of the Spanish government that's still loyal to the king while he is in exile. And the Spanish Americans want to do the same thing, and they want to be represented in these Courts of Cadiz. And so they're asserting to these Spanish representatives that we are just as representative. We have just as much a right to be represented as you all do in this body, because we're equal status. We're not subservient. But the Spanish representatives rejected this idea, and so in all across Spanish America, so like in Caracas, in Buenos Aires, a lot of the elites began to form their own caretaker juntas, or kind of committees, to demonstrate their loyalty to the Spanish crown, but also to assert their autonomy within the larger kingdom. But by 1810, independence movements had begun to break out. We have rebellions in Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina, and other pockets of rebellion throughout the region. But we're mostly going to talk about these 3 cases. So, who leads these independence movements? As I mentioned before, they're mostly wealthy Creoles. They're inspired by the ideals of the Enlightenment, the American Revolution, and the French Revolutions, and their resentment of privileges for Peninsulares. So, they're just tired of being pushed aside and being treated as less than. They want to represent themselves, right? No taxation without representation. Very similar to independence leaders here in the United States, the founding fathers. Castas, Africans, indigenous peoples, they're almost left completely out of these early calls for independence. These are just really mostly led by wealthy Creoles. In the fringe areas, like Venezuela, they are wanting to get more independence, not only from Spain, but also from the larger and more powerful viceroyalties like Peru and excuse me, and New Spain, pardon me. So in Venezuela, the conflict is between the mining centers, say in Bogota for gold and Lima where the silver's going through, and the kind of agricultural elite and the haciendas out in the countryside. In Rio de la Plata, the Creoles very quickly take over the city of Buenos Aires, but the interior remains loyal to the king. And they are not pacified easily. It takes a very long time. We're going to talk even longer. It's going to take beyond independence for the Argentines to actually really kind of get control of their national territory. By 1815, all of these conflicts have come to an end. They just don't have enough popular support yet. In New Spain, there is an early rebellion led by a Catholic priest named Father Hidalgo. New Spain was a special case. It had the majority of Creoles in the entire empire. So 4 out of 10 Spanish Americans actually lived in New Spain. And with Zacatecas and all of its agricultural wealth, it was the jewel of the Spanish Empire. There are a lot more Creoles in New Spain than there are Peninsulares. So they have quite the advantage of numbers there. And in 1810, this priest incites the mestizo and indigenous population to rebel against Spain. And it's actually very selfish. He finds out that he has been accused in the court of the Inquisition in New Spain. And he doesn't want them to take him. And so he incites this rebellion. And he gets these people to follow him because he says that we're going to revolt against Spain. We as Americans are going to kick the Spanish out of our lands, right? He's going to start making a native outsider argument. He's captured and made to confess and then executed. But the cause is picked up by one of the only not white leaders of the Spanish-American independence wars, and this is Father Jose Maria Morelos. Here's a picture of him on his horse. He was a mestizo priest who kind of took over the reins of Father Hidalgo's rebellion and took it even a step forward, calling an end to the caste system, so an end to kind of racial hierarchy and discrimination. He actually declared independence in 1813 before the rebellion was put out and he was executed. And this would make the Mexican or the elites in New Spain fearful of starting an independence war because they were afraid they wouldn't be able to control the mestizo and indigenous masses. So That's where we're starting. Those are kind of the early moves. This week you have key concept quiz 4. That's pretty self-explanatory. Short answer quiz 3 based off of this lecture and your readings. If you have any questions, want to get any clarity, let me know. I'll have grades for your first 1 or 2 tomorrow, hopefully. So that'll give you guys an idea if you need to make a few adjustments before I get to grading this one. For module activity 4 this week, you're going to read Simon Bolivar's letter from Jamaica. So I want you to read kind of the social into the social tensions. So what complaints does he have against Spain? How does he describe the state of the independence wars? And what kind of language from the Enlightenment is he using? And if you need a refresher on the Enlightenment is a late 19th century philosophy that that the United States Constitution is based on. So it's based on the idea of popular sovereignty, that the people should have control over their government. Individual liberties, such as the right to private property, free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom from quarter, like you don't have to keep soldiers in your house, things of that nature. So you're going to look for that language. And then for your prep this week for your presentations, you have Latin American thought activity number 2. And this is going to be having you do some research into the historical context and contribution of the piece that you're studying. So you'll want to take a look at the date, like the original date of publication. You may want to kind of do a little research on on people who have written about um, the context and the contribution of your writing, and you should be able to find that pretty simply. So just be looking for the time period in which your intellectual lived and worked, and what kind of connection did that intellectual have with some of the major historical events and changes. Are they part of a new ideological current that's emerging? And what's the fallout? Like how does this piece end up affecting kind of Latin American thought? The idea that Latin America itself has its own sort of philosophy and intellectual tradition. How is your author in this piece contributing to that? So you will need to do some research. I don't expect you to be able to just off of the top of your head know. So do some research, a little deeper research on the piece itself for this activity, okay? As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please shoot me an email. So far, I'm very pleased with you all, and I hope you keep up the great work. And I'll be back with your module lecture 5 a lot quicker than this one, okay? Thanks a lot. Have a great night. Bye.